Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Mission Matters. I'm Reverend Christine Keddy, and I serve on the missions as Director of Missions and Elder Ministry for the American Baptist Churches of Massachusetts, which we affectionately call TABCOM. And I'm very excited this morning to have us as part of our radio broadcast for TABCOM Voices. Wonderful author and minister and pastor and teacher, many hats. He wears many hats, and has written this wonderful book. So we have with us Dr. Reid Trulson, and this is the book that we are going to talk about. He has written a book about Charlotte Atlee White Rowe. I laugh because I have a hyphenated last name, and a lot of times people give me a really hard time, like at the doctor's office or the airport or whatever. They're like, your name is so long. It's like nothing compared to this lady's name. She has a much longer name than I even have. And she was an amazing woman and is America's first appointed woman missionary. Welcome, Dr. Trulson.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Keddy. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to chat a bit with you about someone who's a very remarkable woman. You asked me to just say a word about myself. I
Please.
served as an American Baptist pastor in California for 3 years and then 20 years in Wisconsin. And then I spent 21 years in different capacities with American Baptist Foreign Mission Society, American Baptist International Ministries. My wife and I were appointed as the American Baptist representatives to Europe in 1995. We lived in Austria and the Czech Republic and served in a liaison role, maintaining relationships between 51 Baptist conventions and fellowships in Europe and the Middle East, and our churches here in the United States. Then I was appointed to be the area director for Europe and the Middle East to give oversight to our American Baptist work in that part of the world. And then for my last 10 years with IM, I was the executive director, the CEO.
So you had the position that now Charles Jones has. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Charles Jones now is area director for Europe, Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, I was the previous Sharon Coe.
Wonderful. And now you're retired.
That's right. That's right.
Sort
I
of.
retired in 2016.
And is that when you undertook the project of writing this book?
Actually, this project began a few years earlier when we were preparing to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society in 2014. I decided to do a little more work in the archives, particularly focusing on the earliest years. And as I did that work, I was surprised to discover that although we had appointed Adoniram Judson in the year of our formation, 1814, we in fact had not appointed Anne Judson. Mm-hmm. And that totally surprised me. I mean, here I'd spent all this time with IM and thought I was fairly well understanding what had gone on, but Anne was not appointed. And as I looked a little farther, I discovered that no women were being appointed in those early days. I began looking at the histories of other mission agencies. No one was appointing women. So Adoniram was appointed in 1814, but then the records showed that the following year, 1815, here was a woman, Charlotte White, who was officially appointed as a missionary and appointed to serve in Burma. Well, again, that I had never heard her name. And I thought to myself, why in the world have I never heard of this woman? And why have I never seen anything about her work in Burma? So it was quite a mystery. And that caused me to pursue the project of finding out who Charlotte was and did she ever go anyplace? Did she ever serve?
Great. Could you then segue right into just telling us a little bit about Charlotte, as much as you can kind of summarize. It's hard because she was an amazing person and did so many things, but
Sure. Well,
I don't.
Charlotte actually had some significant things happen in her life in Massachusetts. She was born in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster. When she was 11 years old, she became an orphan. Uh, she was the youngest of 11 children in the family of Judge William Augustus Atlee. And so when she became an orphan, she was taken in by her oldest sister, who was married and lived in Rutland, Massachusetts. So Charlotte spent her adolescence and early adulthood in Rutland. There, she met a merchant, Nathaniel White. They got married. A year later, they had a baby boy. 5 months after the birth of the baby, Nathaniel died. And then 4 months after that, the baby boy died. During that dual trauma, Charlotte moved from Rutland to Haverhill. She may have moved there because a number of her husband's relatives lived in Haverhill. Now, Charlotte herself is something of an ecumenical woman. Her family in Pennsylvania were Anglicans and obviously Episcopalians after the Revolutionary War ended. She married and was part of the Congregational Church in Rutland. But at Haverhill, she met the Baptists. And she experienced a spiritual renewal that she referred to as her conversion. She was baptized in the Merrimack River and joined the Baptist Church in Haverhill.
I'm just going to interrupt you real quick there. There's a part in the book when she gets baptized in the river that I loved, because it talks about how so first off, it struck me that she, after these horrible tragedies of losing her husband and her young child, still had any faith at all, let alone the vibrant faith she had that was filled with joy. And there's a scene where she gets baptized, and it said when she got baptized, she went into the water singing. And there were some folks that sort of poo-pooed her a little bit, saying that that was ostentatious, that she would have expressed her joy in that way at her baptism.
Right. Isn't it interesting that a woman and a man can do exactly the same thing, but their actions will be interpreted in different ways? So instead of,
Amen.
when she wades into the river and starts singing, instead of seeing that as a spontaneous expression of her spirituality, some people thought it was just being ostentatious.
Right.
To her personality.
That tells a lot, I think, about her personality too. That really struck me. It was one of the first things that I was like, gosh, she's been through these horrible tragedies, and here she is still joyfully wanting to serve. Gosh, I wish I could just have a conversation with her.
I do too.
Anyway, okay, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but finish telling your little synopsis.
Well, now, of course, you folks are well aware that Ann Judson was from Bradford, just on the south side of the Merrimack, and Harriet Atwood was from Haverhill, just on the north side. So these two young women were at this time preparing to marry Adoniram Judson and Samuel Newell and become missionaries themselves. And that caused a great deal of chatter, as this was an unheard of kind of thing. This may relate to this question about who was the first woman missionary. The Congregationalists, of course, sent Anne and sent Harriet Newell and sent Roxana Peck in 1812. But notice that I said they sent them. They did not appoint them. And this was the issue. It was one thing to send a woman. It was something very different to appoint her, because appointment established an official relationship between the individual and the sending agency. It was in some ways comparable to the ordination of a pastor. And this is a time period in which the separate spheres ideology was very strong in the United States and in England. The idea that from creation, by our very nature, men are intended for a public sphere of activity, business, politics, religion, etc. And women are intended for a domestic sphere of activity, the home, raising the children, making sure the kids have faith, this sort of thing. And the role of a missionary was considered to be a public role and therefore not appropriate for women. So this is the controversy. We don't know exactly the details of Charlotte's discernment of her call to missionary service. She does say that she sensed that call, she discerned that call while she was in Haverhill. She then moved to Philadelphia, joined the Fifth Baptist Church, which was also called the Sansom Street Baptist Church. The pastor was William Stoughton. He and his wife Maria became strong advocates for Charlotte. There in Philadelphia, after the Baptists organized nationally as a mission movement, she and Maria Stoughton worked together and formed a women's mission society within their local congregation. So the following year, Charlotte wrote a letter applying for appointment, and she was appointed. Now, the board that was called the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions met monthly to do the work of the Baptist Mission Society. But it was made up of 21 men, and they lived all the way from New York State south to Georgia. Well, there was no way that 21 men could come together once a month in Philadelphia to do the work of the board. So their constitution allowed a quorum of 7 men to act on behalf of the full board. So the vote was taken, but it was to appoint Charlotte, but it was not a unanimous vote. At least one person objected, and that was Reverend Henry Holcomb, who at that point was the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Holcomb's view on women was, as he wrote in a circular letter to the Baptist Association, that in the church, women were helpful and were ornamental, but in some regards, they were inferior to men. Men were created in the image of God, and women should not do anything that usurped the authority of a man. Therefore, he said it was inappropriate. And he also maintained that had all 21 members of the board been involved in the meeting, there's no way that Charlotte would have been approved. So although her appointment was legal, the rest of that quorum agreed to poll all 21 members. Now, it takes at least a month for a letter to travel by horse from Philadelphia to Georgia. So it's going to be a several month process to send out the letters and get a response. But one by one, the responses came back. The question in the letter was, is it legal to appoint a woman as a missionary? And did the word missionary in the Constitution mean only ordained men? You see, the word missionary was being used. It was a word that had been coined by the Jesuits in the 1500s, but it was not defined. So as the responses came back, a majority said, yes, we did not define the word in our Constitution. It is therefore legal that Charlotte was appointed. So her appointment was not revoked. It still stood.
I'm going to stop you there again, because this leads right into one of my questions, the first question that I was going to ask you. On the second page of the preface of the book, you talk about how you feel that her story will shed light, I'm quoting you, shed light on the persistent gender bias that still influences women's opportunity and the valuing of women's accomplishments. Why is this an important goal for you?
Well, it's an important goal for a couple reasons. One is very personal. My mother was a woman. My wife is a woman. We have 2 daughters. We have a granddaughter. I think they and all women should be treated just as men are treated. I think it's a matter of justice. And my understanding of Scripture is it is also a fundamental biblical principle. All human beings are created in God's image. And so it's a matter of justice. In addition to that, I've been privileged to sit under the ministry of a number of very talented women pastors, and have found that a number of passages of Scripture have been opened with new insights that I had never received under the preaching of other men. So I've experienced women's ministry and know its validity and its importance.
Thank you. All right. I know so for our recorded portion of the broadcast, we're definitely not gonna have enough time. But one thing I really enjoyed about your book is the way that you took Charlotte's story as kind of the central story, but you did a masterful job of sort of weaving in other people in her story and how those other people influenced her, and also setting sort of the stage historically of what was going on culturally and sociologically at the time. But you did it in a way that it was telling a story. It wasn't, so it's a history book, but a lot of us, I think, sometimes find history books to be a little bit like wah, 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 wah. And this was like a story, but yet you were weaving in so much rich historical fact. Like the bibliography section of your book is like 20 pages long. So all I could think about was, the amount of research that must have gone into this. Must have been massive. First off, did you have a helper with that, or did you do it all yourself? And how long did it take you?
Well, in a sense, I did not have a helper. I did the research by myself and the writing by myself. But in a larger sense, there were many helpers. The librarian at the Angus Library and Archive at Regent's Park College, which is the Baptist school in Oxford, was very helpful. The records of the British Baptist Missionary Society are archived there in Oxford. And she was able to lead me to a wonderful trove of letters that Charlotte had written to the BMS from India. Likewise, the staff at the American Baptist Historical Society, now in Atlanta, were extremely helpful, as our staff at the Mercer University Press. So clearly there are other people who assisted in this process. Process took me about 5 years of research and another year of completing the writing.
And you started writing it when?
Well, I began writing parts of it as I was doing the research, but the final writing was in the last year, so mid 2019 to mid 2020.
I was telling my husband this morning, he was sort of asking me, what are you going to do today? And so I was telling, and I had, as I was reading the book, finishing it up last night, he was he was with me, next to me, and I kept having these insights. And I said, this book, seriously, like every church should have this in their library, and every seminary student, especially if they're studying Baptists, if they're a Baptist and they're studying Baptist history, needs to have this book as required reading on their syllabus. So have you been successful in getting the book out in academic circles? And are there professors that are using it in their teaching?
I do not know the answer to that question. I know that Mercer University Press has sent copies to a number of academic institutions, but I don't have an answer for that question.
Okay, well, it should be. I'm going to be getting it out there and telling as many people as I can.
I think as American Baptists, it's important for us to know that our predecessors took a very bold step for their age
Mhm.
when they appointed Charlotte.
Right.
And they took a lot of guff for it,
Yes.
but they should be commended for having taken that action.
It would have been very helpful to me. I taught Baptist polity, history and polity at Yale Divinity School for a number of years when I was living in Connecticut. And a book like this would have been genius because I drew on thing like Anne and, but I didn't understand the relationship between sending and appointing. That itself is good to know, very good to know.
Right. So I'm going to try to rush us because we only have about a few minutes left for this recorded portion. And there's so much, you've basically brought us to the point where she's getting ready to go on her journey. And I guess I will tell the listeners that they're going to have to get the book to find out what happens when she goes on her journey. But it is extremely remarkable. She goes over there as a single woman, widowed. And when she gets over there, she meets a young missionary who was over there with his wife and family and had lost his wife in a tragic accident, and they become married. So she meets her second husband on the mission field. They get married and they begin doing their work together. And she does everything. She has a facility for the languages, and she's able to pick up the Hindi language very quickly. And she realizes she has this passion for educating children, and she wants the children to be taught in their native language. And she realizes that they don't have curriculum materials for the children in their native language. So she writes a grammar in Hindi, and she writes a spelling book in Hindi that are then disseminated and used throughout the area. Meanwhile, she's doing all this fundraising. She's having more babies. She's also raising the children of her husband he had children from his previous wife before she died. And so she has stepchildren, she has children of her own. So she's a mother, and she's a fundraiser, and she's a teacher, and she's holding meetings in her home where she's presiding, but they're not allowed to call it preaching. And there's a section in the book that talks about that little controversy. But I will just urge our listeners, and then we're going to sign off on the recording portion, and we'll open this up to discussion. But I will urge our listeners that especially if you have any interest in not only church history, Baptist history, women's studies. I mean, I think, gosh, every women's study course should have this on their syllabus. So Dr. Trulson, can you tell us quickly, how do we get this wonderful book?
It can be ordered directly from Mercer University Press. That's mupress.org or .com, or Barnes & Noble, have it, Amazon. But I'm an advocate of supporting independent bookstores, and any good independent bookstore, you can order it through that store.
Wonderful. So I want to thank you very much for visiting us today at Tabcom Voices. And I'm going to sign off on the radio portion of the broadcast, and we will continue this discussion in the Zoom room. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.